Imagine waking up one morning to find a massive steel fence blocking the entrance to your own ranch. No warning. No permission. And to make matters worse, the Homeowners Association, the HOA, claims you now need their approval just to step foot on your own land. Most people would have given up. But this man, he found a loophole so powerful, it turned the entire HOA into his prisoners, because he held the only key to their gate. The sun had just begun to creep over the wide Texas plains, spilling golden light across the tall grass. It was a sight Robert Johnson had admired nearly every day for the past 20 years. His ranch wasn't just land, it was a legacy. His cattle roamed freely, their silhouettes dotting the horizon. The creak of the barn door, the smell of hay, and the rhythm of boots against dry earth were as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. This ranch had been his father's dream, a dream Robert inherited and carried with pride. From dawn till dusk, he worked the soil, mended fences, and raised livestock, not for wealth, but for the simple honor of keeping his family's land alive. Every ridge, every oak tree, and every worn trail held a memory. But on this morning, something was different. As Robert saddled his horse and rode toward the entrance road, he noticed a strange shimmer of metal glinting in the distance. His brow furrowed. He urged his horse forward, heart tightening with unease. And then he stopped dead in his tracks. Across the entire property line stretched a brand-new steel fence, tall, strong, and freshly bolted into the ground. It was a fence that hadn't been there yesterday, a barrier that now cut him off from the very heart of his ranch. Hanging right in the middle was a bold blue sign, freshly screwed into the gate. Property access managed by the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. Robert's chest tightened. His calloused hands gripped the reins as disbelief washed over him. He hadn't agreed to this. He hadn't signed any contracts. He hadn't sold a single inch of land. Yet here it was, a wall standing between him and everything he had built. The cattle in the distance continued grazing, unaware that their owner had just been locked out of his own land. Robert swung off his horse, boots crunching against the dry dirt. He walked closer, scanning the fence. The steel was new, the posts anchored deep, and the lock glistened under the rising sun. Whoever had done this had done it quickly, efficiently, and without his knowledge. And then he heard footsteps. From the gravel road came a woman dressed sharply in a navy blue suit. A string of pearls rested around her neck, and a clipboard was tucked under her arm. Behind her, 2 sheriff's deputies followed, their expressions unreadable beneath their hats. The woman stopped just a few feet from Robert, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. She cleared her throat with authority, then spoke in a cold, rehearsed tone. "Sir, according to the HOA guidelines, your ranch is now under managed access. You'll need HOA approval to enter this property." Her words cut through the quiet morning air like a blade. Robert's eyes widened, then narrowed. He clenched his fists, trying to steady the storm rising inside him. His jaw tightened as he stared at the woman, then at the deputies standing silently behind her. "This is my land," he said firmly, his deep voice carrying the weight of generations. "My father worked this ranch before I did. You don't get to put up some fancy fence and tell me I can't walk on my own soil." But the woman didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her clipboard and replied smoothly, "The Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association has jurisdiction now. This land falls within community boundaries. Compliance is mandatory." Robert could hardly believe what he was hearing. Jurisdiction. Community boundaries. His ranch had stood long before the new subdivision, long before the manicured lawns and identical houses appeared down the road. This wasn't some suburban neighborhood, this was ranch country, and it always had been. The deputies shifted uncomfortably, but they said nothing. Their hands hovered near their belts, not in aggression, but in quiet readiness, as if waiting for Robert to snap. But Robert didn't snap. He simply stood there, staring at the fence, the sign, and the people who had brought them. Anger swelled in his chest, hot and unrelenting, but beneath it was something deeper, something heavier. It wasn't just anger. It was heartbreak. He thought of his father, who had once stood on this very land, smiling with pride as Robert helped mend an old wooden fence post. He thought of the nights he had camped under the stars, listening to the coyotes howl, dreaming of passing this land on to his own children one day. And now all of it felt under siege. Not by thieves, not by drought, not by hardship, but by paper, politics, and power. Robert turned back to the woman, his voice low but steady. "You may think this fence can stop me. But let me tell you something, you can't fence out a man's soul. And you sure can't fence me out of my own land." For the first time, the woman hesitated. But she quickly regained her composure, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "Sir, if you do not comply, further legal action will be taken." Robert said nothing more. He simply stood in silence, watching as the woman and the deputies walked back down the road. The dust from their steps rose into the morning air, fading into the horizon. And there he remained, one man, standing before a steel fence, knowing that this was only the beginning of a battle he never asked for. This wasn't just a fence. This was a war for his freedom. For weeks, Robert Johnson tried to reason with the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. He walked into their meetings, hat in hand, not as a man looking for trouble, but as a man demanding fairness. He spoke with calm dignity, explaining that his ranch had been there long before the neighborhood, long before the identical rows of homes, neatly trimmed lawns, and freshly paved streets had even existed. "This land has been in my family for generations," he told them. "My father worked it, and his father before him. We ran cattle here when this entire county was nothing but open range. You can't just erase history with paperwork." But his words fell on deaf ears. The HOA board, seated at their long polished table, never looked at him with respect. Instead, they stared as though he was an outsider, an inconvenience in the way of their carefully planned community. Their answer was always the same: community development standards require uniform fencing. Your ranch isn't in compliance. Robert would leave each meeting with frustration boiling inside him. They weren't listening, not really. To them, he was just one man standing against the weight of a system, and they were certain the system would crush him. Day after day, Robert fought to reach his own land. He would climb into his dusty old pickup truck, drive around winding country backroads, and search for side paths to his ranch. Sometimes he managed to squeeze through gaps in the fencing. Other times, he had to trek on foot, hauling feed and supplies by hand just to tend to his cattle. But every time, the HOA was there. Representatives in clean suits would drive out in their shiny SUVs, waving clipboards and legal notices. "You're trespassing," they'd shout, even as he stood on his own soil. "You'll be fined for unauthorized access." And if it wasn't the HOA, it was deputies, called out to monitor the situation. Robert knew most of them by name, men he'd shared coffee with at the diner, but now their uniforms forced them to stand on the other side of the argument. They didn't want to be there, but they couldn't help him either. The whispers soon started spreading through the neighborhood. "That old rancher lost his land," one woman said at the local grocery store. "He should just sell and move on," another added. "Fighting the HOA is a losing battle," someone else muttered. Even some of his neighbors, folks who had once shaken his hand at the feed store, now looked at him with pity, or worse, with ridicule. Robert heard it all. And though he held his head high, each word dug into him like a thorn. One evening, after another exhausting day of skirmishes with the HOA, Robert sat down on the creaky wooden porch of his ranch house. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple. His cattle were just specks in the distance, grazing peacefully, unaware of the storm that loomed over their owner. The air was still, save for the chirp of crickets and the occasional lowing of cows. Robert leaned back in his chair, tipping his hat forward to shield his eyes from the last rays of light. His calloused hands rested heavy on his knees, his heart heavier still. Doubt crept in. Was he really fighting a battle he couldn't win? He thought of selling, just walking away and starting over somewhere else. But then he thought of his father. Memories came rushing back, sharp and vivid. He remembered being a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing by the fence with his father. The two of them had been fixing a broken post under the hot Texas sun. Robert had been tired, frustrated, ready to quit. His father had rested a strong hand on his shoulder and said, "Son, they can put fences in your way, but never let them fence in your spirit." Those words echoed in Robert's mind now, clear as the day they'd been spoken. His father had lived through hard times, droughts, debt, even the threat of losing the ranch once before. But he never gave in. He never surrendered to forces that wanted to take away what rightfully belonged to their family. Robert sat up straighter in his chair, the weight of despair lifting just a little. His father's words weren't just advice. They were a command. A legacy. A reminder that some battles weren't about money or convenience. They were about dignity. Robert took a deep breath as the stars began to appear, one by one, across the Texas sky. He realized this fight wasn't just about cattle, or fences, or even land. It was about respect. About standing up to people who thought they could push him aside just because they had rules, money, and power. The HOA thought they could wear him down, break his spirit, and force him to surrender. But they didn't understand the kind of man Robert was. He wasn't just protecting acres of grass and barns. He was protecting a dream passed down through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. That night, as he rose from his porch and walked back inside, Robert made himself a promise. He would not give up. He would not sell. He would not surrender. The HOA might have put up a fence around his land, but Robert Johnson was about to show them that no fence on earth could contain his spirit. And with that thought burning inside him like a fire, he was ready for whatever came next. For months, Robert Johnson had felt like a man trapped inside a cage that wasn't of his making. Every time he looked at the steel fence cutting across his land, it was as though someone had built a wall between him and his very soul. The HOA had pushed him into a corner, and though he fought with everything he had, their rules, fines, and legal threats seemed endless. But then, one quiet morning, everything changed. Robert had driven into town to pick up supplies, and as he passed by the county courthouse, a thought tugged at him. What if there was something in the records, something the HOA hadn't noticed? He parked his truck, walked up the courthouse steps, and pushed open the heavy oak doors. The air inside was cool and still, the faint smell of paper and ink lingering in the hallways. Robert tipped his hat politely to the clerk at the front desk, then asked if he could see the land records for Lakeside Meadows. The clerk raised an eyebrow but led him to a room lined with shelves of thick, leather-bound books and digital records. Robert pulled up a chair and began to dig. Hour after hour, Robert traced survey maps, property deeds, and plats. His rough hands, usually meant for ropes and tools, turned page after page of crisp legal documents. The more he read, the more his frustration grew, until suddenly, something caught his eye. It was a survey line, drawn years before the HOA ever existed. The parcels of land the HOA had purchased surrounded his ranch like a ring, but there was one piece missing. The strip of dirt road that led to the main gate, the only legal access point into both his ranch and the subdivision, wasn't theirs at all. Robert blinked, leaning closer. He double-checked the maps, then checked again. It was no mistake. That narrow strip of land, the very ground the steel gate was built on, was still technically public property. And as of now, it hadn't been claimed. A slow smile crept across Robert's face, the first real smile he'd felt in months. The HOA thought they had him fenced in, but they had overlooked the most important piece of all, the gate itself. Robert knew what he had to do. The next morning, dressed in his cleanest shirt and wearing the same old cowboy hat his father once wore, he walked back into the county office. The clerk who had helped him before looked surprised when Robert slid a slip of paper across the counter. "I'd like to purchase this strip of land," Robert said simply. The clerk adjusted his glasses. "You want the entrance road?" Robert nodded. "Every inch of it." The paperwork wasn't easy. It took weeks of filings, signatures, and more money than Robert cared to admit. He drained most of his savings, money he had set aside for new equipment and repairs. Friends told him he was crazy. Some even warned him he was throwing his life away. But Robert didn't waver. He knew what was at stake. This wasn't just land, this was the key to his freedom. And finally, after all the waiting, the day came. A heavy envelope arrived in his mailbox, stamped with the county seal. Inside were the official documents, bearing his name. Robert Johnson was now the legal owner of the road, the gate, and the only access point into Lakeside Meadows. That evening, Robert drove down the dirt road in his pickup, a mix of relief and pride swelling in his chest. He stopped at the steel gate, the very gate that had once mocked him with its bold blue HOA sign. But this time, it wasn't a symbol of defeat. It was his. He stepped out, boots crunching against gravel, and ran his hand along the cold steel. Then, with deliberate calm, He slipped a brand-new heavy-duty padlock through the latch and clicked it shut. The key jingled in his hand, a small, simple piece of metal, but it carried the weight of victory. For months, the HOA had tried to shut him out, to strip him of his rights. Now, with one bold move, Robert held control of the only gate in and out of the neighborhood. He leaned against the fence, watching the sun sink low over the horizon. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, the ranch alive and free once more. Robert knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA wouldn't take this lying down. They would show up, papers in hand, threats on their lips. They would call meetings, call lawyers, maybe even call the sheriff again. But this time, Robert wasn't afraid. He had something they couldn't take with words or fines: ownership. The deed was in his name. The law was on his side. And most importantly, his spirit was stronger than ever. For the first time in months, Robert felt the weight lift off his shoulders. He no longer felt like the man who had lost his land. He was the man who had reclaimed it, piece by piece, and now held the key that no one else could touch. As night settled over the Texas plains, Robert whispered the same words that had carried him through the darkest days. They can put fences in your way, but never let them fence in your spirit. Now, those words weren't just hope. They were truth. And with the deed in his hand and the gate locked tight, Robert Johnson knew the fight had only just begun, but this time it was a fight he was ready to win. The next morning, the Texas sun rose hot and bright, baking the dusty earth as Robert Johnson walked down the narrow strip of road that was now his. In his hand, he carried a brand-new, heavy-duty lock, thick steel, unbreakable, the kind used on ranch gates meant to keep out more than cattle. He stood at the entrance, staring at the cold iron bars that had haunted him for months. This gate, once a symbol of his humiliation, would now become a symbol of his victory. With steady hands, he looped the chain through the latch and snapped the lock shut. The sound of metal clicking into place echoed across the empty road. It was more than just a lock. It was justice. It was dignity. It was freedom. Robert slipped the key into his pocket and exhaled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in months, the gate wasn't a reminder of what had been stolen, it was proof of what he had reclaimed. It didn't take long for the news to spread. By afternoon, the familiar crunch of tires on gravel announced their arrival. A black SUV rolled up, polished and imposing. Out stepped the HOA president, the same woman with a navy blue suit and clipboard, her heels clicking sharply against the ground. She carried herself with the same smug authority as before, her chin lifted high as though she already owned the outcome. Behind her came two deputies, the same ones who had stood silent on earlier days. Their faces betrayed no emotion, but their eyes flicked between Robert and the woman as if they already sensed today would be different. The woman strode right up to the gate, clipboard tucked under her arm, and spoke with a voice dripping with confidence. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her words slow and deliberate, "you are in violation of HOA access rules. Open this gate immediately, or we'll fine you again." Robert didn't move at first. He let her words hang in the air, carried away by the warm breeze that rustled the grass beyond the fence. Then, with a calmness that unsettled everyone present, he reached into his pocket. A small metallic sound rang out as he pulled out the shiny new key. He twirled it effortlessly between his fingers, his expression unreadable. "This gate," Robert said slowly, his voice steady and sure, "is now mine." The woman's confident smile faltered. Robert stepped closer, holding the key up to catch the sunlight. "According to county records, if anyone, HOA, resident or deputy, wants access through here," he paused, letting the silence do the work, "they'll have to go through me." The words struck like a hammer. The woman's face drained of color. Her clipboard trembled ever so slightly in her hands as she scanned the deputies, searching for backup. But the deputies didn't move. For weeks, they had been called to enforce the HOA's demands, but now the law had shifted. Robert wasn't just another landowner making noise. He had proof, paperwork, and title deeds on his side. The deputies exchanged uncertain glances. One adjusted his hat, the other shifted on his boots, but neither stepped forward. They knew this wasn't their fight anymore. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. Robert no longer stood as the man boxed in by fences, mocked by neighbors, or threatened with fines. He stood as the rightful owner, the man holding the key to everything the HOA thought they controlled. And he didn't need to shout or wave papers in the air to prove it. The quiet strength in his voice, the gleam of the key, and the lock firmly in place said everything. The HOA president opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The words she had prepared, about compliance, about rules, about community standards, suddenly seemed hollow. She realized what Robert already knew. The HOA could put up as many fences as they wanted, but none of it mattered without the gate. And the gate belonged to him. Robert slipped the key back into his pocket and folded his arms across his chest, standing tall. "You tried to box me in," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But you forgot something my father taught me a long time ago. You can fence a man's land, but you can't fence his spirit." The deputies lowered their eyes, one even suppressing a faint smile. The woman's lips tightened, but she knew the truth. She had lost. Robert turned his back on them and began walking slowly toward his truck, each step measured, each movement a statement. He didn't need their permission anymore. Behind him, the HOA president stood frozen, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. The deputies said nothing. The air was heavy, charged with the undeniable fact that the balance of power had changed. That day marked more than just a victory. It was the end of Robert's humiliation and the beginning of his control. For the first time in months, he wasn't the one being fenced out. The HOA was. Word spread faster than wildfire through lakeside meadows. The man they thought had been beaten, the man neighbors whispered about as the rancher who lost his land, had just turned the tables on the entire HOA. The homeowners who once mocked him now found themselves in an impossible position. Their shiny new subdivision, with its perfect lawns and identical houses, was trapped behind the very gate they once used against him. And there was only one person with a key, Robert Johnson. It started small. A delivery truck carrying groceries stopped at the locked gate, unable to get in. The driver honked, frustrated, until finally, word reached Robert. Then came a moving van, loaded with furniture for a new family. The workers leaned against their truck, sweating in the Texas sun, waiting for someone to open the gate. Soon, it was residents themselves, people late for work, parents trying to get their kids to school, contractors waiting to mow lawns. Cars lined up along the roadside, engines idling, drivers honking. The once proud HOA community was now paralyzed, cut off from the world outside. And Robert, he was the only one who could change that. The HOA president showed up at his door, her clipboard noticeably missing this time. Behind her stood several anxious homeowners, their polished confidence gone. They didn't look like people ready to enforce rules anymore. They looked like people desperate for mercy. "Mr. Johnson," the president began, her tone no longer smug but strained. We need access. This is a misunderstanding. Surely we can reach an agreement." Robert studied them carefully. For months, these were the same people who had waved papers in his face, threatened him with fines, and tried to shame him in front of the community. Now, they stood on his porch, humbled. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply folded his arms and spoke with quiet authority. "I'll allow access," he said. "But on my terms." The group shifted uneasily. The president's voice trembled. "And what terms are those?" Robert looked her in the eye. "First, you drop every single fine you've ever filed against me. Second, you remove your claim of control over my ranch, permanently. And third," he paused, letting the silence draw out, "you issue a written apology, a real one, for trying to fence me out of my own land." The crowd gasped. The president's face went pale. But Robert's tone left no room for argument. For the first time since the battle began, the HOA had no power. The rules in their thick binders meant nothing. The papers they waved meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the deed, and Robert had it. They stalled, they debated, they tried to negotiate. But each passing day without access only made the community more desperate. Residents complained, services stalled, and life inside the subdivision ground to a halt. Finally, the president returned, holding a single sheet of paper. It was an apology, signed by every board member of the Lakeside Meadows HOA. The document admitted they had overstepped, rescinded every fine, and pledged never to interfere with Robert's ranch again. With calm dignity, Robert read the words, nodded once, and slipped the paper into his pocket. Then, and only then, did he unlock the gate. The cars poured through, the trucks rumbled in, and life in the subdivision returned to normal, but everyone knew things had changed forever. That evening, when the commotion had died down, Robert stood alone by the gate. The heavy steel lock still hung there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a symbol of triumph. The sun dipped low, painting the fields in a wash of gold. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, tails flicking lazily in the evening air. For the first time in months, Robert could breathe freely. His land was safe. His dignity was restored. He leaned against the gate, the cool iron under his hand, and let the quiet soak into him. All the long days of struggle, all the nights of doubt, had led to this moment. He hadn't just protected his property. He had protected his name, his legacy, and the spirit of a man who refused to bow. As twilight settled, Robert whispered the words that had carried him through the storm, the same words his father once told him long ago. They can put fences in your way, but never let them fence in your spirit. But this time, the words didn't feel like comfort. They felt like victory, because now he had proven them true. And that's how one man turned the tables on an entire HOA and proved that determination always wins. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel Voice of Hope for more powerful stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.